The Experience of Thinking. A series of talks on change of consciousness in the writings of European philosophers, by John Thompson. Episode 13. Russell and Wittgenstein.
Last week, we looked at the work of Martin Heidegger, and the hero for this week, Bertrand Russell, is a great contrast with Heidegger. For Heidegger, it's a question of, shining a light into human existence, trying to see what is it to be human, and how it's lived, how it's experienced. And he creates a kind of philosophical language in order to make this visible, this inner life, this existence, this experience of what it is to be human. And sometimes the language is a created one. He invents words, he builds words, because he has to reach at a meaning that's difficult to access. But it's everyday as well. And now we're crossing the channel. It's only a short distance. At the narrowest point, 21 miles or something, 30 kilometers. But psychologically, quite a big jump. And the person we're going to talk about, Bertrand Russell, born in 1872, died in 98. He is a very good representative of this island consciousness, if I can use that word. And he describes, he wrote a history of European philosophy, Western philosophy, and in that he points to what he sees as the difference of this island attitude, where people born on an island want to make sure they're on solid ground. And also, all the philosophy that you build is built on your experience of the world through your senses. That's the basis of it. So you can be as detailed as you like, and also you get hold of the truth piecemeal, in bits. It doesn't come to you as a great revelation. It's not that kind of thing. So you don't want to get involved in too much introspection. Looking inwards is not greatly valued. And of course, that's the tradition that Russell stands in. You go back to people like the person who was his godfather, John Stuart Mill, if you go back to Bentham, if you go back to Hume and Locke and these people, that's generally this empirical, practical, down-to-earth, sense-based attitude. And when this type of philosopher comes to a general idea, he has it only provisionally. And then you have to work to establish it. So you work what was called inductively. That means you look at the evidence and you see if there's enough evidence to support your theory. Okay. A little word about the biography of this man. He was born, as I say, in 1878. His grandfather, Lord Russell, was Prime Minister of England at a very important time when they passed what's called the First Reform Bill in 1832. And that was really the first attempt at democracy in this country. There was a kind of democracy for the landed and the wealthy, but it wasn't really for people who didn't have land and so on. And the First Reform Bill in 1832 was a step in that direction. So his grandfather was part of that picture. But his own parents died when he was a child, 2 or 3 years old. His mother, his father, and his sister. So that was the experience of this young boy, and he was brought up by his grandparents. Well, he was a rather unusual boy, very gifted, and at 18 he was at Cambridge studying mathematics, and then once he'd studied that, he got his BA in that, he went on to study moral sciences. And 22, he was married. For the first time, I think he was 3 or 4 times married, but the first time he was a young man. And then he was working still at Cambridge on a theme which was central for his work. And I'll talk about that later. He worked for 10 years on this task of studying the relationship between logic and mathematics. I'll say a word about it later. And he worked with another very great philosopher, in some ways maybe even a greater one, Whitehead. And for 10 years he worked on this and produced 3 sturdy volumes called Principia Mathematica. And in this he hoped to have established that simple fact that mathematics is an objective science, not a subjective one. Then he was a pacifist during the war, and in 1918 he was actually imprisoned for 6 weeks or something because he made anti-war demonstrations. So that's the character of the man. He continued to be a teacher. He wrote many, many volumes on all sorts of themes. I've got books that this man published: Logic and Knowledge, The Impact of Science and Society, Authority in the Individual, New Hopes for a Changing World, Human Knowledge, etc., etc. A whole page of volumes that this man produced in his lifetime. And the outstanding ones are the ones I mentioned, the Principia Mathematica. Later on, he writes this whole history of Western philosophy without even mentioning Heidegger. So you see the big division between these two streams I call the existential stream and the analytical stream. And Russell, of course, is central to this analytical stream. Now, nevertheless, although he was imprisoned because the authorities didn't like his anti-war attitude, and he was also refused teaching posts in New York during the Second World War because of his attitude towards war. And he went over there to take up a teaching post, and the authorities said, "I'm sorry, we're not allowing you to teach." He had to come back to England. Nevertheless, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1950. Must have been 89, 70. He was awarded the Nobel Prize, and later continued active right up to his death. In fact, so active that the plane that was bringing him back from Sweden during one of his lecture tours crashed in the water, and this 80-year-old, or maybe 90-year-old, was swimming about in the water and survived. He's quite an unusual individual. Okay. Now, the stream he comes from, I mentioned, is this English empiricism, and one of the great figures from the English point of view, not considered very highly on the continent, was his godfather, John Stuart Mill. And he was a proponent of what's called utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism is a look on the question of what's the best thing, the summum bonum for society. And the summum bonum is that everyone achieves his own happiness or the pleasure of the majority. And how do you achieve that? So you make legislation, you do all sorts of engagement in changing society so that each individual can work towards the achievement of his own highest satisfaction. So that's utilitarianism in a very small nutshell. And that's the stream. Russell had a rather sharp penetration of these big schemes and said, all right, if your legislators are also looking for their own best interests and happiness, how do you know they're going to legislate for the best interests of other people? And we've got an excellent example of that going on in England right now with the expenses, claims, and so on. They've been obviously legislating for their own highest pleasure and happiness. Okay, I'll say a word now about this work he spent 10 years on with Whitehead, Principia Mathematica. For ordinary people, it seems quite an unimportant question, but for philosophers and also in the engagement that philosopher has with science, quite an important one. Now, going back as far as the Germans, Immanuel Kant, he had the idea that mathematics has an essential connection with how we are human. In other words, it's not describing the world just objectively out there. By mathematics, we're talking about arithmetic, algebra, geometry, and so on. We assume that is just, when we go through school, that's quite an objective affair. But for a person like Kant, our understanding of mathematics and also space and time has got a way, is very much connected with how we are inwardly constructed as human beings. So you could say it's partly subjective. Mathematics is, for Kant, and some followers who were very important in the 19th century, mathematics is not the objective thing that we sometimes imagine it is. And it was the task that Russell set himself to establish that if you look at all the theorems and all the mathematical statements, you can actually reduce them by logic to one or two very trivial and obvious axioms, basic statements. And if you can do that, then it's not dependent on human subjectivity, it's dependent on what it is. It's a thing out there, just like anything else out there. It's objective. 10 years he spent on this. And at the end he said, I exhausted myself intellectually doing that work. I was never able to do the good work afterwards that I'd been doing at that time. It's interesting that a German philosopher, Gödel, proved in the 30s that actually all mathematics is dependent on assumptions that you can't prove. So he kind of undermined this huge work of Russell. However, after this work, and I've spoken about his engagement during the war, he was at Cambridge teaching and so on. And then he builds in a number of books, including his History of Western Philosophy, what philosophy is for him. And one can say that, you remember Descartes, who had the impulse to examine the world and find if he could find anything certain in it. And his famous statement, cogito ergo sum, indicated that this only thing I can be secure about is that I think. So the only certainty for Descartes was that the human being thinks. What's out there, how I come to know that that's a table, that's not quite so certain. And he has to establish a way of proving that that really is there, that table. Now, in a way, Russell starts in one of his descriptions of the same way. So I look at a table and I'm told it's oblong, but it doesn't seem oblong to me. And also, I see this one's a kind of light brown, but there it's shiny and it's not the same. Now, which is the real thing? Is it the shiny surface, or is it this? Or is it this one, which is more in shadow? Where's the reality? It's supposed to be oblong, but I don't see it oblong. And so he starts a little like Descartes and begins quite skeptical view of the nature of reality out there. Quite skeptical. What can I say that I really know is true? And for him, interestingly enough, he takes the opposite view of Descartes. He finds the mind quite suspect. And so that we can't find our basis in mind, like Descartes did, but we must find our basis in examining the sense world out there and trying to make meaning out of that. And in order to do that, it's important to understand how we describe that, how we put things into groups and so on. So language is very important. Now, language itself is the only means we have of knowing the world. If we didn't have language, we wouldn't be able to construct the world out there at all. With language, we can do that. So we must understand language. So the analysis of language becomes an important element for Russell. And also, in language, we want to know what the truth is. We want to know what falsehood is. How do we establish these? How do we come to know what is true and what is false? And not concealed, but implicit in all our descriptions of the world is our ability to argue or to discuss logically. So what is logic? Logic? Well, statements can be valid or invalid. And how do we know when we're making a valid statement or making an invalid statement? So logic becomes an ingredient that we have to understand. And of course, the study of logic goes back to Aristotle and the Greek, but in the 19th century, a huge development in trying to understand processes in the mind, which we call logical process, had taken huge steps, very complex steps, and Russell was engaged in this. So in one of his books, he sums up doubt and uncertainty regarding the nature of the world mustn't undermine the confidence of the scientist. So although everything is in doubt there, there's no reason for the scientist to be living in lack of doubt and in anxiety like Heidegger. Of course, Heidegger is a very different picture. But this sense of confidently observing the world, seeing that we can't know everything about the world, but not being too disturbed by that, that's the nature of the world, gives him a very different attitude to his thinking and to his way of being from the continental existential one, which was primary experience was anxiety and being towards death and so on, these concepts of Heidegger and later Sartre, who also talks about the nature of the human being and this total uncertainty. Uncertainty is not a problem for the islanders. We can handle it. We can handle this uncertainty, but we must keep our inner confidence. Okay? Then we mustn't go too far in our self-reflection and upset this calm sense of balance and anxiety, and bring upon ourselves anxiety. And also another essential theme that for Russell is that virtue and morality, remember he had studied this at university, is an access for everyone. There isn't a kind of special steps you have to make to become virtuous. Virtue is open to every human being in an equal way. So that's a very democratic kind of approach, very different from the approach of the very undemocratic Heidegger. And then the other emphasis, he says one has to come to feel, to be at home with one's loneliness. So you have the picture of a thinker who is happy to be on an island, isolated in his own island, spectating the world, looking at it, confidently, although he knows, I don't know all the answers. I can live with that. And then how I'm going to approach that is piecemeal. I'll look at that, I'll try to understand that plant. I won't assume that if I understand that plant, I've got a hook on the whole of the universe. Everything is quite in its own area. I'll find connections, but that will be bit by bit. The world is higgledy-piggledy. It's not organic. It's not something that once you look, the whole is the totality, and I'm now going to understand the pieces. Rather, the pieces are the whole, and you can put them together. It's a very atomic view of the world. So he was very anti any form of idealism, where you bring into your understanding of the world things that are going on in the human soul or the human mind. And then, of course, he realizes this, you see, he's living at the beginning of the 20th century. Well, of course, steam engines, electromagnetic machinery has all been developed. The airplane is now being developed. The car has been developed. The telephone. All these beginnings of modern technology are already there. And so science is already making a huge impact on not only on the social life of people, but on the psychological attitude of people. And Russell fully accepts that. And he sees a very close relationship between the tasks of the philosopher and the task of the scientist. The philosopher has to deal with general principles and perhaps be a guiding element in the search that the scientists are making in their different disciplines. So that basically all knowledge for Russell is scientific knowledge. There is no other knowledge. Now you recall the questioning attitude that Heidegger had to the whole of modern technology. So again, that describes this huge split between this empirical Anglo-Saxon approach to philosophy and the continental. He was also influenced by something that was coming to the forefront, led by a figure called James Watson, and that's behaviorism. Now, behaviorism is quite a significant development in psychology. Russian Pavlov and people like that, and then later the American Skinner, are all connected with that development that to understand the human being, you have to look at how the human being acts, not what the human being says, not what the human being exposes as thought or feeling. How does the human being act? And so it gathers a whole lot of information about human behavior as the only grounded way of trying to understand the human being, and of course the animal as well. So he was also somewhat critical in a way, but also very impressed by this approach, Russell. So he listened to the teachings of James Watson and incorporated that in his idea. So you see a man who's obviously born with a silver spoon in his mouth, as you say, had a grand upbringing, very brilliant, and he's taking up this philosophical attitude that the world's out there. I don't have to start looking at my world in order to understand it. I can now scientifically begin gradually, in a gradual way, to put it together to make meaning out of it. So that's a very brief run-through of his approach in philosophy. Empirical, piecemeal thinking, not organic, spectating, looking at the world, as it were, I'm always outside it, looking at it and not incorporated in that world. But he was a man also of a lot of involvement in social life and politics. He supported the feminist movement. He was anti-war. He was a pacifist. He started a school with one of his wives because he had horrified with the kind of education that he himself probably had in one of the public schools. And his books poured out on all these questions. And during the war, I told you he was imprisoned for making statements in London against the war. Of course, there were people who were imprisoned for that during that war. Or they got white feathers and so on, people who were against war in England in the 1914-18 war. And he stood up against that. And after I told you, during the war also, the Second World War, he was rejected by the American universities. After that, he founded what's called the Pugwash Conference, which was anti-nuclear development, a conference which he founded and became the president of the anti-nuclear campaign in this country. And this man in his 70s or something was prepared to, with an umbrella, sit on the wet pavement protesting against the development of nuclear weapons in this country and, of course, in America and Russia at that time. So he was a very engaged political activist. So you see, this one who's looking at the world from outside a little bit as a spectator, and yet in the social political sphere, active, very active, and in a significant way. His philosophy is not so significant today because we face different problems, but in his time, you could see he was a spectacular individuality in the Anglo scene and the British scene. Now, there came into his life an extraordinary man who was totally different in personality, background, everything. And these two came together into an extraordinary meeting of destiny, I suppose, one can say. And that is Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1889 to 1951. Let me give you a picture of Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein was born in Vienna. So it's the Vienna, well, everyone knows Freud was Vienna, architecture, beginning of modern architecture, the Jugendstil, that kind of thing. Then, of course, there was a whole lot of Zionism. The first Zionist, Herzl, was a Viennese journalist. Hitler comes from Vienna. Who's the atonal music? Schoenberg, Viennese. And I mentioned architecture. One of them said that Vienna was a research laboratory for world destruction. That was a person called Karl Kraus. Well, the father of Wittgenstein, Karl Wittgenstein, was the wealthiest man in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He had made his money through iron and steel. So he's the Carnegie or the Krups of Austria. Extremely wealthy. They had converted to Catholicism, being Jewish, they had converted, and so the family were brought up as Catholics. Wittgenstein was the eighth in this family. A brilliant family. They were brilliant especially in music. One of them was quite an extraordinary musical genius, and because of difficulties with his father and so on, he went to America and then eventually committed suicide. Another brother, younger brother, also committed suicide in Germany, and another brother, Paul, was a soldier in the First World War. He was a concert pianist, and while he was a soldier, he got his right arm shot off, and Ravel wrote the composition for the left hand for Paul Wittgenstein. So quite an extraordinary family. There were women also, there were 3 or 4 women in the family, and one of them was also a concert pianist, I think it was piano, and others all had this talent. He didn't show that as a young boy. He showed himself more with a practical bent, and his father thought, well, I'll send him to Linz, a smaller town, and I'll have him educated there. And so he was educated in a small school in Linz, and another person in that school at the same time was Adolf Hitler. I don't think they were in the same class, but they were certainly in the same school at the same time. Well, Ludwig, when he grew up, he was certainly musical, but he wasn't going to go in the direction of his brothers or sisters. He wanted to develop this practical bent. So when he was 19, he went to Manchester to study aeronautics. Now, it's the beginning of the aeroplane industry, and Manchester was one of the centers. So he goes there, and he's got mathematics, the mathematical capacity, and he's got a certain sense for the engineering faculty, and he studies there for several years. And even he makes a unique contribution to the development of aeronautics. So he's at the age of his early 20s, he's already showing something of his genius, that he can actually make an impact on aeronautics pretty much when it's at its beginnings. And then he reads the book. And the book he turns to read is Russell's Principia Mathematica. It's a book of logical symbols, which if you open it, you can't make any sense of it unless you understand it. And he devours this book and becomes taken with the concept of entering into the philosophical realm. There's a great German philosopher called Gottlieb Frege, who's working in the same field as Russell. And so he begins to write a manuscript and sends it to Frege. Frege can't make any sense out of it, don't understand it, puts some questions to him and says, go and see Russell. So this man, in his early 20s, turns up at Cambridge. And Russell meets him and finds, he describes him? This is a description of what he calls the true philosopher. Russell says of him, he's the most perfect example of genius, passionate, profound, intense, and dominating. Philosophy, says Russell, is a reluctant mistress. One can only reach her heart with the cold steel in the hand of passion. So that's Wittgenstein, the cold steel in the hand of passion. And he was a very difficult customer to deal with, because he would, at the end of the lecture, sometimes, this is Cambridge just before the war, in First World War, there might be three students, and Russell would turn up to deliver his lecture, and there could be 3 students there. So he said, come and join my lectures. So before then. And at the end of it, when Russell was ready for his coffee or going away and do something else, this man would buttonhole him and pour questions at him and question his logic and so on. And Russell was overwhelmed by this man who never stopped talking and always full of his own dominating ideas and hardly left him any space. And so sometimes he talks about this terrible German. Of course, he wasn't German. He was Austrian, first of all, but that one didn't mean anything to Russell, the island, this terrible German. And then he came to have such an affection and love for this extraordinary man. And he realized that this is the only man who can take my work further. Russell is 20 years older, roughly. So he's... when he's 20s, in his 40s, mid-40s. So with a man who's already got a huge reputation, to have the humility to recognize this young man is the one who can take my work further. And not being an easy person, he's not comfortable in this sort of tea-drinking society of Cambridge with people meeting in their rooms and so on, that kind of comfortable university background that Russell was used to. So he left Cambridge. And he went to Norway and got a house there and lived alone and so on. And then when the war broke out, 1914, being Austrian, he went back to Austria and said, I want to join the army. So he volunteered for the army as a simple soldier. And then he was fighting against the Italians. And after that, he was recommended for valor. He got a medal for being brave. Then he volunteered to go on the Russian front, to fight against the Russians, because there must have been an Austrian battalions also fighting alongside the Germans in the Russian front. So he went there, and he also was awarded for bravery. It's an extraordinary man. And then at the end of the war, he ended up in a prisoner of war camp run by the Italians. And it's there that he wrote the only book he ever published. And it's a book that is very slim, 60 or 70 pages. A lot of it's just bibliography and stuff at the back. And it's basically 7 sentences. And he wrote this in the prisoner of war camp and sent a copy to Russell. who was in prison in England for being a pacifist. So it was interesting, the difference between these two fellows. And this book was, for him, the final statement. This was going to clarify all the basic philosophical problems. And there he was, writing it in a prisoner of war camp. Russell looked at it and was astonished. And then, after the war, he came back to Cambridge, and the book was published. And it's got a strange name, Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. A tractate, a treatise on a philosophical treatise on logic. Put it like that. And why is it so extraordinary? It seems very simple. There are, as I say, 7 sentences, and they're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But each sentence is subtended by a series of other sentences derived from it. So it's 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4. Then when you've exhausted that, it takes about 12 or 13, then you start with 2, 2, 1, 2, 3. But the 7th sentence is just one sentence. So, what is so extraordinary about this book? Why did Russell see it as the dawning of a new age? He sent a copy also to Frege, who found it very difficult to understand what he was talking about. And so it shows you, even these great philosophers are having difficulty with him, so don't expect it to be an easy ride. It starts with a kind of statement like this. The world is everything that is the case. Now, that doesn't make much sense in English, everything that is the case. It's a translation of a German word which is Sachverhalt. That's a fact. We could translate it. So the world is really a totality of facts. Now, a fact is different from an object. The sun rises at 7 o'clock or whenever is a fact. You can see the world as you see as objects, as the sun and the planets and this and you and me are objects. So the world is a totality of facts. I'll give you an example. It's a question of language, the understanding of language. Now, if you look at language, you can look at it in quite different ways. A person comes and says, I bought you these flowers. Well, that's language. I bought you these flowers. Okay? Now, you could be interested in this from a psychological point of view. I bought you these flowers. Oh, I bought you these flowers. The same statement, but psychologically, something quite different. So when you look at language, you have to see that you can penetrate it in a psychological way. But that's not the only way. You can also look at language from the point of view as, what's the connection between the statement I'm making and the world out there? For example, it's raining. I can make that a statement. It's raining. And then I look out and see, does the world out there correspond with the statement? So that's epistemology. Epistemology is basically, how do we not only know the world, but how do we bring the world into knowledge through language? So that's quite another way of looking at the same thing, language. I bought you these flowers. You could look at it from an epistemological point of view. There's another point of view, which is a more scientific point of view, where you look at a plant and you want to understand the relationship of the plant and how it behaves or grows or whatever. So you examine it in all sorts of ways and you describe what you see. You make descriptions. And then these descriptions appear in language. So all the great scientists are written their experiences, whether biologists or physicists, in language, even if that language becomes a mathematical one. So language then is a description of the reality that we examine, and we question statements, and other scientists might come along and say, well, it's not quite like that. This is what I've discovered. So then you have to correct your description. So you're looking at making a description of the world and bringing it as close as possible to what you call truth. So there's a scientific truth. But it's, depending on how you look at it, it's something that's provisional to some extent. So that's another way of looking at language. Now, the way that the Tractatus looks at language is quite different. He's not concerned with studying the world. He's concerned with studying language as a symbolic structure. Now, when I say table, I can write table. Now, table up there, if I write that, that's simply a symbol, and you will read it, and you will know that that's referring to something like that. I could write tish or tab is the same thing, or something in another language, and that would be a sign referring to something out there. So what Wittgenstein is doing is understanding the nature of this symbolic language. So when we are saying the world is a totality of facts, if I can put together all the propositions, proposition being just statements, the philosophers talk about propositions instead of statements, put together all the statements that symbolically refer to the facts of this totality, then I'm describing the world. It's eventually, of course, you end up by not looking at language, but looking at a kind of algebra for language. For example, the famous argument goes back to Aristotle, which is called a syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Okay? You probably remember that. Now, you make a premise, all men are mortal. That's a general statement. If the premise is right, and the next premise, Socrates is a man, he's not an ape, he's not a machine, he's a man. If that's also correct, then the conclusion will be correct. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, once you get into symbolic logic, then you don't use Socrates and you don't use mortal. You say A is B, or P is Q, or something like that. You use an algebraic sign because it doesn't matter if it's Socrates you're talking about, or Churchill, or anybody. It doesn't matter if you say talking about chairs or windows or horses or whatever. So you substitute that for algebraic language. So it becomes, and they're using symbols that enable them to describe what all looks like, what no looks like, and so on, in symbolic language. So it becomes another language. You have to learn that. And that's part of the statement in this Tractatus, the difficult part. It's all a bit difficult, actually, but that's where it's leading us. And I think we just wanted to understand that. He's looking at trying to understand that if I can say what can be truthfully said symbolically, then I'm separating out the kind of what he called nonsense that people say, where their symbolic language is not referring to anything. And he concludes that the most philosophical questions are not just incorrect, they're nonsensical. The kind of general philosophical question makes nonsense. It doesn't make sense. So it looks as if he's trying to clear the decks to get rid of all sorts of Hegelian talk and idealistic talk and so on, because the language used in all metaphysics is vague, it's uncertain, you can't establish what it's referring to exactly, and so on. So that's the tenor of the book. I'll give you just a little bit of how he approaches it. If we accept this, the world consists of a totality of interconnected atomic facts. That's basic facts. He never makes clear what these basic facts actually are. And propositions, he said, makes pictures of the world. So a proposition like it is raining is picturing a world that isn't a picture, a reality. But when I make it into a statement, it's a picture of the world. For a picture to represent a fact, it must in some way possess the same logical structure as the fact it's referring to. So what he's saying is that if we had a perfect language, that language would be structured inwardly in exactly the same way as the world is structured out there. There would be a parallelism between world, language. But no language is like that. They're all loose and vague and so on. You know, if you say a fork, what am I talking about? Something in the road or something I eat with? Or, the language is vague. But we could construct maybe a perfect language, and that's what it would look like. What would be the propositions would be logically coherent with the logic of the world. Now he says no such language exists, right? So we have to create that language. And so the central part of the book is the attempt to establish how you can analyze statements in accordance with this truth element, this truth function, as it's called. The other thing he says is that this relationship I'm talking about between language and world, you can't describe in language. You've got to get outside language, and that's not possible. So you have to show it. You can't explain to somebody else why this logic that I'm using corresponds with that. You have to just show it. So he's taking us to a realm which is outside language. Then he takes us through this logical part, and at the end of this sixth proposition, which I've just mentioned, he makes an analogy, and this is a very strange analogy. The philosopher Schopenhauer had compared a book he wrote to a ladder, and he said, when you've read this book, you can throw the ladder away, because now you've got there. And so Wittgenstein, after proposition 6, he says, now, if you've used this as a ladder, you can throw it away. He also says, you will only understand this book if you've been through it, before you've read it. Okay? Yeah, in other words, you have to inwardly experience what I'm talking about, and then you'll read it. If you haven't inwardly experienced what I'm talking about, you'll not make sense of it. And the last proposition, proposition 7, one sentence. What we cannot speak of, we must pass over in silence. What's that saying? What we cannot speak of, we must pass over in silence. Well, some of the great philosophers, especially in Vienna, were quite thrilled with this book because it seemed to get a grip on this logical problem. But they weren't very dissatisfied with the end of the sixth proposition and this final one, what we can't speak of, we must pass over in silence. They said, if you cut off the end part of your book, it's very good, you know? And Russell wasn't quite sure about what he means. Is he saying that all religion, ethics, mysticism, all that's you've got to be silent about. You can't talk about it anymore. There's no language to deal with that. The only thing that language can really deal with is making the propositions in the way I've described, so that they contain the logic of the world. That was published in 1919 or something. So that's nearly 90 years ago. And since then, people have been poring over this slim volume and see what really is this man saying. And very different views have come about. And I'll give you an indication of what it means. Out of this book, there came in Vienna and also in England a very strong philosophical group called logical positivism. And they took their clue from this book by Wittgenstein, saying, all right, there are meaningless statements. God is in heaven, meaningless. That is meaningless. That's what they say. So let's look at what is meaningful. So there was a famous philosopher in England, A.J. Ayer, who developed a book, Language, Truth and Logic, and on this principle that we look at statements. The table is in the room. The table is made of wood. I could put the as a demonstrative. Table, is, exists, in, contains, the, demonstrative, room. Everything I can point to. So that is a true sentence, okay? And so on. We look at the world and see where can we make such sentences. And that's logical positivism, in a way. But the other viewpoint is this. It connects with something, a statement that Wittgenstein wrote down because he was continually taking notes, endlessly writing in notebooks. And this appeared not in anything published, but in another writing. He's a questioner. He said to his sister, I'm just a searcher. I never find what I look for, but he's as if caught by a question and he can't give up until he's reached into that question. So he's driven by his questions. So he's not a man like Russell sitting in his leather chair and looking at the world and saying, do I know anything about that table? That's not him. He's driven by these inner questions that he has to find an answer to. And so he writes down in his notebook, what do I know about God and the purpose of life? So while he's writing this book, which people think is just a statement about the things we can say about the world that are true, he says, well, what can I say about God and the purposes of life? And he writes this, I know this world exists, that something about it is problematic, which we call its meaning. What's the meaning of the world? That this meaning doesn't lie in it, but outside it. So by just examining the world, you can't find its meaning because it's outside it. You don't get it by burrowing into it. That life is the world. Life is the world. That my will penetrates the world. That my will is either good or evil. Therefore, that good and evil are somehow connected with the meaning of the world. The meaning of life, that is the meaning of the world, we can call God. I cannot bend the happenings of the world to my will. I am completely powerless. I can only make myself independent of the world by renouncing any influence on happenings. There's a kind of element in him of disengagement, a Buddhist attitude perhaps, totally different from his master Russell, the socially, politically engaged. Now, so why I gave that out is some of the interpretations of the Tractatus are very different from the logical positives. They say this is a man who's clearing the decks so that we can begin to understand what is the relationship of human being to ethics and religion and so on. He's simply making things clear. He's clarifying. That's, in fact, what he says the function of philosophy is, to clarify. It's not to build new systems. It's not to answer old questions in a new way. It's to make things clear. And in so doing, he makes visible to us the reality of ethics and religion. He was deeply religious. He felt that Christianity was the one thing that made him able to live. After this had been published, after the war, he went back to Vienna, and his father had died. He was one of the wealthiest men in Europe. He gave away all his wealth, everything, to his family. So he had nothing. For a time, he was an architect. He designed a house for his sister. Very interesting. Brilliant. I mean, it's a very Jugendstil style, no decorations, no fancy stuff. Very beautiful placing of rectangular forms in an absolutely bare surface. So he designed that, which is built, stands in Vienna. And then he decided, I must do something. I'll be a teacher. Went to a training college to be a teacher. All those youngsters sitting there, and he's in his 30s now, and tries to teaching, and absolutely hopeless teacher, I think. The children made fun of him and didn't attend properly, and he got angry and all sorts of things. And he had to put himself through this purgatory. Lived in Ireland, lived in Norway, in different situations. And eventually he came to reject all that he'd written. He said, I reject all that. It's no longer where I stand. He said, that book that I wrote was dogmatic, and I must now reject dogmatism. Dogmatism is, for me, to be totally rejected. At the time, he didn't consider this a dogmatic statement, this book. He considered it was simply clear statements of what anybody who'd been through his experience would acknowledge. But now he looks back and sees I was bringing a dogmatic attitude to philosophy, and I must reject that. So he continues to write, filling notebooks, and nothing else is published during his life. They're called the brown book, the blue book, and so on, to distinct when they come into publication. And then his final work, which is published immediately after his death, is called Philosophical Investigations. And that's a longer book than this one. And again, it's divided into statements like 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 2, 2, 3, 2, 4, and so on. But it's much longer, and the statements are much longer also. It's not just short aphoristic statements. So that is published, and this shows a totally different approach to language. What is it? He begins to look at language and rejects any view that you can stand outside language and describe its functioning. If I can put it in my own words, he says you have to get inside language and see how it functions. So the meaning of a word is not something that I impose on it, it's how it's used. The use of a word indicates its meaning. So then he develops what he calls language games. Let's look at how we express an order. How do we express an order? Do this, bring this. How do we do it? Look at the structure of it. And then look at how we acknowledge and obey. What's the language we use? Look at the language we use in describing something. Look at the language we use in imagining something in the future. Look at the language we use, and so on. It makes kind of a game in which we can play into the being of language. And of course, anyone who's lived a certain length of time sees that language changes. People don't use words that I used in my childhood. They don't exist any longer. They're no longer current. And people use words that I never used, and I have to become familiar with them. And so language is really a conglomeration of entities that are in use and brought into use and go out of use, and that is the nature of language. So it's a very different one. Now this again, which is a totally different view of language from the Tractatus, is again taken up by all sorts of people, psychologists, sociologists, and learning people studying languages and teaching languages and so on, find these ideas extremely seminal. They're seeds for new investigations. So this extraordinary man has totally abandoned a book that he thought was bringing an end to all this endless, unnecessary philosophizing. Then in his own life, when he's still a young man, he rejects the whole lot and sets off on a new path. So quite an extraordinary individual. I remember myself just to look at the question of language. There's a little story in Dickens' Hard Times when Mr. Gradgrind, the inspector, comes to the school. And he's going to test these little children to see if they're making progress, a real inspector. So Mr. Gradgrind is there, and all these little children are sitting in front of him, somewhat terrified. There's a bright little fellow in the front with spectacles, who's obviously very sharp, and there's a little Jenny at the back who's very pale and very scared about this gentleman who's standing in front of her. Her father is a farrier. Now, a farrier in those days, again, language doesn't exist any longer, was somebody who looked after horses. So Mr. Gradgrind said, "Now, what is a horse?" And the little boy in front puts his hand up. "Yes, a graminivorous quadruped." "Very good, very good, very good." "Jenny, what is a horse?" Now, Jenny is living with horses all the time, and she doesn't know what a horse is. She can't say a word. So this is Mr. Gradgrind inspecting the progress of these children. So that, when I was teaching, I always remember that story. And I thought, well, what is a horse? What is a horse? So I could see in Waldorf education a kind of secret, because there are different ways the child in their education encounters a horse. I think it's in class 2 or 3 where they meet the farm. So what does the horse do? Of course, you can hardly find a horse on a farm now, but the working horse. Then if you come to the Norse myths, you meet a horse, Odin's horse, which has got 8 legs. So a horse with 8 legs, that's something. So there's an imagination that it's horses. It's not a cow, it's a horse. It's got 8 legs. This is apparently connected with the Eightfold Path of the Buddha. So anyway, it's a horse. And then the horse, of course, a very important symbol in India and in Greece and so on. And you can touch these, the horse from the Parthenon, and then also Alexander, how he tames his horse and so on. So that you've not said to the children, what is a horse? A graminivorous quadruped. But you've given pictures in which the child is coming to his own inner picturing of the horse, which can include Odin's horse. So it's a little bit this language game, I felt. And when I read Wittgenstein, I thought, maybe that's the kind of world you have to enter into in the teaching of language. Not the language of just definition. This is it, this is it, this is it. How is language used? I mean, it goes into these language games, the games that the children play, which Opie made a wonderful study. Was it Peter Opie? I don't know if you see that book now. A fantastic study of children's language games. That kind of thing. This is all the substance that people should study if they want to understand language, not the Tractatus. Then he comes back to Cambridge for a while, but his relationship with Russell is over. Russell doesn't understand the philosophical investigation. He thinks it's all trivial stuff. He doesn't think that Russell has really understood his Tractatus even. And so the relationship is now quite cool and changed. And then he goes away and he dies of cancer when he's 51, so he's in his 60s. He dies of cancer. He writes this pretty near the end of his life. I'll read that and then we'll stop. It's all one to me whether or not the typical Western scientist understands or appreciates my work, since he will not in any case understand the spirit in which I write. Our civilization is characterized by the word progress. Progress is its form rather than one of its features. Typically, it constructs. It is occupied with building an ever more complicated structure. Even clarity is sought only as a means to an end, not as an end in itself. For me, clarity, perspicuity are valuable in themselves. I'm interested in having a perspicuous view of the foundations of possible future building. I'm not aiming at the same target as the scientists.
The next episode is on Martin Buber.